So, howdy, folks. Welcome to the March edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Glad to be with you all. When we talk about cattle trails, I immediately think of Jesse Chisholm, the man for whom the trail is named. But what about Jesse Chisholm's family? Well, we're going to learn some fascinating history today about that on Cattle Trails Showcase. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the communities, historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the Chisholm and the Western Trails and other trails in the future. Showcase is brought to you by the International Chisholm Trail Association, of which Dennis Katzenmeyer is president, Michael Grauer is vice president, secretary is Nancy Lawrence, and the treasurer is Mary Lou Rivers. Our showcase chair is Lonnie Steben. Lonnie, good to have you. Our speaker today is the award-winning author of 15 books, remarkably enough. She's an acclaimed speaker. She's a noted author. Her name is Jonita Mullins, and she lives in Muskogee, Oklahoma. Sometimes known as the History Lady, she for some years has written a monthly column about the history of her region in Northeast Oklahoma. And today she's going to tell us about Sampson Chisholm, the adopted son of trailblazer Jesse Chisholm. So Jonita, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invitation to talk to you about Sampson Chisholm. Let me get my screen share going here so you can see my PowerPoint. Is that showing up for everyone?
Looks great.
Okay, Sampson Chisholm. So not nearly as well known, of course, as his famous father. Some references call him his adopted son, but others call him the foster son. I looked on Ancestry, though, about Sampson, and there's no indication that he was adopted. He's just listed as his youngest son. So I'm not really sure exactly the connection or relationship, but he did take the Chisholm name either way. So we're going to talk a little bit about his trail, and I took the Chisholm Trail logo and added Sampson there so you can see. I know you all are experts on the Jesse Chisholm Trail, so I'm not going to dwell on that. We'll focus on his son, Sampson. And here's a photograph of both men. I think I see some family resemblance between the two, so I really think he probably is Jesse's youngest son. And I have a theory of why he's referred to as his adopted son in some instances. If you're familiar with Native American culture, and I have done a lot of research and writing on the 5 tribes in particular, located in Oklahoma, these tribes are matrilineal, meaning that you traced your family tree through your mother rather than your father. So Sampson Chisholm's mother was Creek, not Cherokee, as Jesse Chisholm was. And so he would have been regarded as Creek. In the Native American culture, your father's heritage, his lineage, all of that just didn't count. You were what your mother was. And so his mother was Creek. He would have been recognized as Creek. Now, I'm from Muskogee. I live in Muskogee, and the tribe is also known as the Muskogee tribe. Historically, they were called Creek, and that's what I usually refer to them as. Today, they are trying to move towards being recognized as their name for themselves, Muskogee. So I may use that name, Muskogee, on occasion for the tribe, and they're one and the same, Muskogee and Creek. But in the Native American culture, Sampson would have been Creek because his mother was. But the Cherokees had recognized in the early 1820s that there was more intermarriage going on between Cherokees and American settlers, whites. And so they feared that they would lose some of their children. If a mother was white or not Cherokee, the children would not be Cherokee. And so they passed a law in 1825, I think it was, that children of Cherokee fathers could be adopted into the Cherokee tribe. So they would be Cherokee citizens. Perhaps that is the reason why Sampson Chisholm is sometimes referred to as adopted, because he's an adopted Cherokee while he is a birth Creek. So that's a theory of mine. I haven't found anything in documentation that states that Sampson Chisholm passed before the Dawes Commission was enrolling tribal members, so we don't know how he would have enrolled, but he probably would have enrolled as a Creek. Traditionally, he does look very Indian to me. He would have just considered himself to be Creek. So that's the culture that we're dealing with. And of course, as a member of a tribe, one of the 5 tribes, they held their land communally. It was considered to belong to everyone, but members of the tribe could claim and utilize as much land as they wanted. So very large ranches began to develop just prior to the Civil War, and certainly they exploded in growth after the Civil War. I know you're all familiar with that Civil War history and how there was this demand for beef, and that gave rise to the trails that all went through Indian Territory, almost all of them did. Now, we don't know much about Sampson's connection or participation in the Civil War. There isn't a whole lot of information about him. We know that Jesse Chisholm managed to maintain neutrality. He would scout for either side. He would scout for the Confederacy or the Union. He was well respected among all the tribes of Indian Territory, did a lot of negotiations, attended a lot of tribal peace treaty talks, all of that. So Jesse was respected as a neutral party, and perhaps Sampson was as well. We don't have any records, or I couldn't find any, that he participated in the war on either side. A lot of Muskogee citizens had to flee Indian Territory during the war, either to Kansas if they were sympathetic to the Union side, or to Texas if they were sympathetic to the Confederate side. So the Muskogees were split down the middle, and a good number of them went to Kansas. A lot of them joined the Union military and fought for the Union side as the 1st and 2nd and 3rd Indian Home Guards. Many of the Cherokees and Creeks were a part of that Home Guard, Seminoles also. But a good number of them were also allied with the Confederacy. And so if they were going to refugee, they went down to Texas, and a good number of them settled around the Sulphur Springs area of Texas. It's likely that that was where Sampson Chisholm also spent the war years, is in Texas, somewhere around Sulphur Springs. I can't see it on my screen, but I think you can see Sulphur Springs way on the far right side of the screen. The star represents approximately where we think Sampson Chisholm developed a ranch during those warrior times that he was in Texas. And probably there were other Creek-owned ranches in that region. So this is where the Sampson Chisholm Trail is said to start, very close to Royce City, east of Dallas, a little northeast of there. If you look directly up from where the star is, you'll see Highway 69. Highway 69 would have been a part of the Jefferson Highway. Jefferson Highway was located right on the Texas Road that ran through Indian Territory, and after the Civil War would become East Shawnee Cattle Trail, which was the first cattle trail to run through Indian Territory. So it is likely that Sampson Chisholm would have run his trail due north and would have picked up the Texas Road somewhere north of his ranch. Ranching was sort of a new enterprise for the 5 tribes who came from the southeastern states. The Muskogees or Creeks were originally from Georgia and Alabama. They did not have big ranches in those 2 states, more mountainous. They lived in more of the mountainous areas of the northern Georgia and Alabama. But when they got out here to the western part of the continent and into the grasslands and prairies of this area, ranching became a much more important part of their economy. They did still hold slaves, and cotton was grown along the riverbanks. Muskogees were very much a people descended of the Mississippian mound builders who usually lived along the banks of streams, either rivers or creeks, and that's where the term creek comes from, because they almost always settled along a creek or a river. So in my area of Muskogee, we have three rivers that come together, the Arkansas, the Verdigris, and the Grand. And there were a lot of cotton farming in those bottomlands. But you get away from the bottomlands and you've got prairie soil that's not very deep. There's a layer of sandstone underneath that prairie land. The sandstone below the topsoil. And so it was better suited for grassland and for grazing cattle. So cattle ranches began to really develop. And I'm sure that they had some going on here in Texas during the Civil War. Here you see the cattle trails. You can see the East Shawnee Cattle Trail running along the Texas Road down to Waco. So Sampson Chisholm's trail would have been east of there, but he probably picked up the Texas Road somewhere still in Texas, south of the Red River, and then continued following it for a time up towards his other ranch. So following the Civil War, it took a few years, but the Creeks who had settled in Texas began to gradually move back home, back to their nation in Indian Territory. And I don't doubt whatsoever that all those ranches were bringing their cattle up to resettle Muskogee Nation and brought their cattle up from Texas with them. So here we show some of those cattle, those beautiful longhorns. I love this photograph of a drive bringing the cattle up along one of the cattle trails. And here's another view of the cattle trails. You can see that the Shawnee Trail split at one point in time after it crossed Red River, came up to Fort Washita, then Bogey Depot, over to Perryville, which later became McAllister, then up to North Forktown. So the Missourians didn't like the Texas Longhorn coming into Missouri. That's why eventually they had to split the trail off and go west into Kansas, because the cattle farmers of Kansas and Missouri didn't like the tick fever that the Longhorns brought up to them. I have marked what I believe would have been the Sampson Chisholm Trail. Again, there aren't any really good maps showing it, but I think he would have probably parted ways from the Shawnee Cattle Trail there at North Forktown. It's called North Forktown because it sits on the juncture of the North Canadian River and the South Canadian River. And a little fur trading community had developed there at that fork. And that is probably the location of where Sampson would have veered away from the Shawnee Cattle Trail, because his ranch lay to the west of the Texas Road. And so I have roughly in the red line indicated where I think the Shawnee or the Sampson Chisholm Trail would have run. He would have crossed the Arkansas and then continued on up through Cherokee Nation into Kansas from there. So here it is again. I've got it marked as a green line. This is a contemporary map from Google. And so you see you follow down there, you follow replaced North Forktown. The North Fork of the Canadian is underwater now as a part of Lake Eufaula. You can see the very large lake there. That is Oklahoma's largest man-made lake. They dammed the North Canadian to create that lake. So where North Forktown was located is now it's under the lake. But the Sampson Trail would have headed a little bit to the northwest up to his ranch, and then would have veered back to the northeast to continue on to Kansas and to the railheads up there. You'll see the town of Bixby and the town of Broken Arrow. Both of them kind of claim Sampson Chisholm. Both of them consider his ranch a part of their history. And so most of what I have found in trying to research Sampson Chisholm has come from the historical societies of Bixby and Broken Arrow. They're both suburbs, southern suburbs of Tulsa. So Sampson Chisholm, I don't find a record of how many acres of land he might have had as part of his ranch. This area was Arkansas River Valley. So the valley, the bottomlands, very rich soil, very rich soil. Cotton was grown there up until the 1930s. And then when the cotton bottom fell out of the cotton market, then they moved to truck farming, a lot of vegetables grown there in those bottomlands. But up away from the bottomlands in the rolling prairie of that area, there were ranchers all over this location, probably 2 to 3 dozen Creek-owned ranches. And there were also Black-owned ranches in this area as well. This is a favorite photo of mine. That rock there in the middle, excuse me, of the North Canadian is called Standing Rock. This is a very old photo because that rock is now under Lake Eufaula. We say that a lot here in Oklahoma. We have a lot of man-made lakes, and a lot of our history is now under the lake. So here is a Standing Rock. It would have been a very recognized marker location that people would refer to. Let's meet at the Standing Rock. A lot of legends built up around this rock. It's supposed to have hieroglyphics on it. It's supposed to have an arrow to a treasure map that Bellstar buried or something, because Bellstar lived in this area. There's in times of drought, you can barely see the top of that rock because the water level now is above the rock, and you can't see it unless there is a pretty severe drought. A few years back, people were reporting that they were seeing the top of Standing Rock because the water levels had dropped so much. But this would have been a marker that cattle drivers coming through that area would have looked for there on the North Fork of the Canadian River. Here's a much earlier map than Google. And this one particularly is about the trail of the Creeks who fled from North Fork town into Kansas. They had chosen to try to remain neutral. Their leader was called Opotliohola, and he led about 8,000 Seminoles and Creeks and a few from other tribes who wanted to be neutral but couldn't because they kept getting attacked by the Confederate forces, and so they headed north. But in addition to Opotliohola's route, which you see over on the left-hand side of the screen, you will also see the Arkansas River running through there. You'll see the 3 forks mentioned down at the bottom where Muskogee is. And then down directly south or down from the word Tulsa at the top, you will see a little town called Wealaca. Wealaca is Creek town. It was the location of a school run by Presbyterian missionaries, and a little community grew up around the Wealaga mission. And you'll see this trail marked up to Wealaga, crossing the Arkansas, and then moving back to the northeast up to Fort Spunky, and then on to Claremore, and then on up into Kansas. That is the Sampson Chisholm Trail. This is about one of the few maps that I have been able to locate that actually shows this trail. It did not last very long, probably less than 10 years for sure. It would have operated probably just after the end of the Civil War up into the mid-70s, when the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas rail line built through Indian Territory. You see it marked a little bit to the east of the Sampson Chisholm Trail. Again, this is all ranch land through here, and the tribes held their land in common, as I had said, but as a tribal member, you could own as much land as you could work. And so it would be not uncommon for there to be 1,000-acre ranches in this area with running thousands of head of cattle. There's some sheep raising, not a lot, and some ran hogs, wild hogs on their ranches as well. Because they were communal in their view of land ownership, they were also very communal in their working together in their spring and fall roundups. They would all go out there, all their ranch hands would go out together, and they would designate a ranch to be a particular gathering point. So all that the cattle that they round up from the open range, they bring to a designated ranch, and then they separate them out by brand. Cow culture was that you respected brands, and nobody tried to alter or steal cattle until, of course, white people started moving in, and then they had a problem with cattle rustling. But up until that point, there was just a communal point of view among the Native Americans. You all worked together, you all shared in the responsibilities, and some of these ranches were quite large and quite prosperous. So you can see Wealaga there. And imagine all of that area being surrounded by some very big ranch spreads. Here is a painting of the Wealaga Mission. It was a school, as I said, had both boy and students and girl students. So you would have had dormitories. It was a boarding school. The homesteads were far flung. So to send your kids to school, it almost always had to be a boarding school in those early days. So the students would have lived on the top floor. There would have been quarters for the teachers, administrators as well. There was a kitchen and back you can see. The classrooms, a dining hall, that sort of thing. Maybe a parlor or two would have been on the first floor. And it would have been a little city unto itself, because these missions, and this would have started in about 1881. These missions had to be self-sufficient because there was not a lot out here, especially sparsely settled. So they would bring their own blacksmiths and their own cooks and seamstresses and teachers, and everybody had to be a part of it. And a little community almost always developed around these mission schools. And so that would have been the case with Wealaga. They got a post office in about 1881 or 82. And this would have been when Sampson Chisholm's trail was running and cattle were moving through there. So in addition to Sampson Chisholm using that trail, many of the other ranchers would have followed that trail as well with their cattle as they were taking them up to Kansas and to the railheads there. Here's a mercantile. Now, I don't know for sure that this was at Wealaga, but I just envision that a mercantile at Wealaga would have looked something like that, with a lot of ranch hands enjoying the accommodations there at the mercantile. I even think I see a couple of marshal's badges among these gentlemen on this mercantile porch, and this would have been typical of the mercantile in that area. There were a number of them all along the rivers, and little towns were developed. The Muskogee Creeks had their own police force as well. They were called light horsemen. The reason they were called light horsemen is because they were more lightly armed than the U.S. cavalry was. And they would have policed the area. So the two men with the badges very likely would have been Creek light horsemen. A number of blacks, freedmen, were a part of the Creek light horse force as well. And so we know that there were Creek freedmen who had ranches in the area. After the Civil War, the tribes had to sign new treaties with the federal government because they had signed alliance treaties with the Confederacy. And so one of the concessions that had to be made in those Reconstruction treaties of 1866 was that they had to free their slaves and they had to grant them citizenship in their tribe. So a good number of the ranches in that area were Black-owned ranches because they could claim as much land as any other tribal member, and many of them did so. So around Sampson Chisholm's ranch, there were, that I know of, probably at least 3 Black-owned ranches as well. And these individuals would become quite wealthy because there was also oil on their lands. The Creek tribe had a lot of oil, as did the Osages and the Seminoles. Those were the 3 tribes that really benefited from oil exploration. So it did not matter if you were a freedman member of the tribe or an indigenous member of the tribe, you could get as much land and use as much land as you wanted until the Dawes Commission began the allotment process. So some very prosperous individuals would have been running cattle through this area at the time of Sampson Chisholm. There's nothing left of the community of Wealaga today, except this little windmill. I went back, driving back through there, I had been told that you could maybe find some foundation stones from the old school, but I never located anything. It's all privately owned, small homestead houses with small acreage around them. But someone has put up this windmill on their property. I don't know if you can read what it says, but it says the Township of Wealaga. So that is all that's left of the little community of Wealaga, where, which would have been the post office box most likely of Sampson Chisholm. Would have been on the south side of the river, just opposite of the Chisholm Ranch on the north side of the river. So this is not a cattle crossing, obviously, there's only horses there, but this would have been, this historic photo gives you a feel for what the river would have looked like. It was very shallow. The Arkansas River is not a particularly deep river, but it's a very wide river. Now it is navigable today up to Muskogee. And it is dredged to 9 feet in depth by the Corps of Engineers, but left to its own devices, it's not very deep at all, has a lot of sand, so it would have been easy to cross cattle. And the river at this point of Wealaga, where the crossing was, the river would have looked very similar to that, about that length, about that depth, and a slow sloping bank that would have been easy to cross cattle right there. I took this picture just about a week or so ago, so it's very current, and you can see the river there and see that the bank is fairly low still. This part of the Arkansas is not navigable, so a lot of sandbars and a lot of sand dredging companies that pull sand out of the river. And there is one that you can see across the river there, but this is fairly close from what I can gather from the little bit of information that is available. This would be very, very close to where Sampson Chisholm's trail would have crossed the river and where cattle would have been driven through there. It would not have been a difficult effort to get them across the river. It's usually pretty shallow, except in times of a lot of rain in the fall or the spring. But most of the time, it's pretty easy to cross and would have been fairly easy to get the cattle through there. This is the road that leads up to that windmill that I showed you. And in my imagination, this was probably a part of the Chisholm Trail. A lot of the roads that developed later were, of course, laid along old trails. And so we know that the highways of today often follow where the trails led before. And this, I think, is probably a part of the Sampson Chisholm Trail. Here's another map of the region. This is Creek Country. As it said, you can see the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas rail line to the right of the screen. If you go up where you can see Arkansas River, and yes, we call it Arkansas in Oklahoma, not all Kansas, but you will see Wealaga. Even though the wording is on the north side of the river, you'll see the little symbol for the town is on the south side. So that is, and it doesn't show the Sampson Chisholm Trail here. I think this may have been a map from an earlier time period. So there is no reference to the Sampson Chisholm Trail. You see, you follow it down at the bottom of the screen, and you see Muskogee there. The road that you do see along there was called the Wealaga Road. It ran from Creek Agency, which is a little community sat east of where Muskogee is now. And that Wealaga Road, some people who own land along that river there say that you can still see a little bit of the Wealaga Road, the trail that runs through there. I'll give you a little aside. I love this story because I just think it's fun. I grew up in Haskell, and Haskell sits very close to the old site of Wealaga. And the Wealaga Road would have ran right through the Haskell area. There is a preservation group in Oklahoma that monitors eagles' nests. And there, of course, eagles always build their nests along rivers. And so there are a number of them along the Arkansas River. And a property owner there at Haskell had noticed a new nest. And so he contacted this preservation group and said, I found a new eagle's nest. And they always name their nest because they think just giving them a number is kind of boring. And they monitor them. Of course, they check on them to check on the health of the eagles and the eaglets and all of that. So they were trying to come up with a new name. They had Haskell nest already, and they were trying to come up with a name for this new nest that they had found. So they contacted me because they wanted something historical, and I had written a history of Haskell. It's one of the books that I did, and they said, we want a cool historical name for this new nest that we found. And the lady that I was talking to said, the property owner says there's a wagon trail that goes through his property. I said, oh, that's probably the Wealaga Road. And she said, the what? She'd never heard of it. And I said, that's probably the Wealaga Road. And she said, I love that name. Can we call this nest Wealaga? And I said, fine by me. So I got to name a eagle's nest. And I think that's one of the coolest things I've ever done. A silly little story, I know, but that's my connection, I guess, to Wealaga and the road that ran from Creek Agency to the mission. Here is another map. This is Google, of course. You see the star down below, that is where Wealaga would have been. And the star up above the river is where the Sampson Chisholm Ranch would have been located. I don't know the number of acreages that he had. Right there at that point was a ferry operation operated by a freedman, a light horseman named Daniel Childers. He had a ranch on the south side of the bank, just opposite of Sampson Chisholm's ranch. So the Childers Ranch would have been to the south of Sampson Chisholm's ranch. To the left side would have been Lewis Bruner's ranch. He was also a freedman. The Spike S Ranch would have been further up the river. And then on downriver on the other side, you'll see the town of Leonard down below. Below that was the Fairview Ranch that belonged to Pleasant Porter, who was a chief of the Cherokees. And then directly south of the location of Wealaga was the Barbie Ranch. Now that is not the Barbie Ranch. Barbie, as far as I know, did not have a ranch in the Muskogee Nation. She's done everything else, I realize, but I don't think she had a ranch. That was the letter B ranch. It belonged to Sam Brown. So the B stands for Brown. Samuel Brown was chief of the Yuchi tribe. So you got a couple of tribal chiefs living here in this area. Very prosperous men. And I'm sure if Barbie had had a ranch there, she would have done very well with it as well. So Pleasant Porter, as chief, helped to organize a stock association called the Muskogee and Seminole Stock Association. They publish regularly in the area newspapers a listing of the brands of their association members. And it's huge. I mean, it is a huge listing. I just pulled out a very small section of it to give you a few of what they would have had. And if you look at the top left-hand corner, John Yarbo had a ranch in that area. His P.O. box was at Wealaga. If you look at the bottom left, you'll see Jeff Davis. He also had a ranch on Polecat Creek near the Bixby area. And Jeff Davis also had his P.O. box at Wealaga. So you get a sense of what was going on here with all of these wonderful ranches that were part of the Muskogee and Seminole Stock Association. And this stock association was that communal brotherhood of cowmen who would go out and gather the cows in from their free range. The Indians didn't put up fences until much later in their history. So it was all open range through there, and they would work together to gather the cattle in every spring, every fall, and then ship them out, either head them up the trail, or by that time in the 1870s, early 1870s, the railroad was already building through Indian territory, so they could bring them to Muskogee. Muskogee was very definitely a cattle town, had a huge stockyards in Muskogee at one time. And so the Katy Railroad that ran through Muskogee did a big business in cattle for a lot of years. So this would have been an organization operating a little after Sampson Chisholm was around. He passed before this stock association developed, but his sons probably continued on and may have been members. I couldn't find a brand for him, but they publish them every few years or so. So it may have been that it just wasn't listed in this particular issue of the paper. There is now today a marker for the Sampson Chisholm Trail. This is in the city of Broken Arrow. They put this marker up in there during their centennial year of 2002, marking the location of where the trail crossed the Arkansas River at the Childers Ford or Childers Ferry. The Sampson Chisholm Trail is recognized here with this marker. And it must have continued, Chisholm Ranch must have continued for quite some time, even though it would have been reduced in size because of the allotments. But it's still known as, that area is still known as Chisholm Ranch today. And there is actually a housing addition that's called Chisholm Ranch Estates. And so you can drive through that area and find the marker, find the Chisholm Ranch sign for that housing addition. It was long now, much longer than Sampson Chisholm's life as this Chisholm Ranch. Another interesting little aside on the Chisholm Ranch is the fact that one of the last owners of it before it was split up was Oral Roberts. And I don't know, most of y'all are my age, so you probably remember the name Oral Roberts. He was a televangelist. He has a university in Tulsa named for him. Before he came to Tulsa and set up his ministry here, he had pastored a church in Enid. So he was associated kind of with both Chisholm Trails because the Jesse Chisholm Trail runs through Enid. And then the Tulsa Chisholm Trail he owned. He actually owned the Chisholm Ranch at one point in time. Of course, it's all broken up now, and small homes or nice homes, estates in that area that are part of the old Chisholm Ranch. So that it's still remembered in this area. Probably nobody beyond the Broken Arrow, Bixby area knows much about Sampson Chisholm, but he is still very much remembered and still very much considered a part of these two communities that are suburbs of Tulsa. So there you go. There's my business card. I hope I didn't rush through this too quickly. I do have a book out on the Jefferson Highway, which was the old Osage Trace, the old Texas Road, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. So if you like that kind of history, my book is available on Amazon. It's published by Arcadia Press. I have a YouTube channel, and I have a lot of little short videos, little vignettes about area history that I like to do. So can I open it up for questions? Do you usually take questions at the end? Do you want to do that, Ron?
Please do, Jonita. Thank you, Jonita. Round of applause for Jonita and this fascinating background on Sampson Chisholm, a piece of the puzzle I'd never heard before. Steve Myers likes to say, you know, the history is much more deep and complex than it appears on its face. Or I started to say, Steve says, people say to him, there was no Chisholm Trail in Texas. And he said, no, that's right. There were 5 of them because there were multiple names, multiple places. This is a fascinating piece that I was not familiar with. The name Muskogee, we see it spelled in a couple of maps and places with a C and a
Yes.
couple of places with a K. And now we know it with a K. Was that just over time that the Indian spelling was used and changed?
It's a funny story. The use of the C, of course, is the tribe spelling.
Okay.
The town itself was named after the tribe, obviously, and originally spelled with a C. Then about 1900, they were changing the location of their post office, and you always had to file new paperwork at the post office. And a clerical error changed the C to a K. And from 1900 on, then we were spelled with a K. I think it's a good thing today because it does help people, at least when they're reading it, to distinguish between the town and the tribe. So if you see it with a C, it is usually referencing the tribe. With the K, it's usually referencing the town or the county, because we have a Muskogee County also.
Ah, interesting. How interesting. Let me see if there's other questions. I don't see questions in the chat. Is any, let's see, Steve, are you raising your hand there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, years ago I was in Broken Arrow and I saw a book in there from the Historic Society, and they wrote about Sampson Chisholm, and they did say that he drove cattle to Coffeyville, Kansas. Have you found information on that?
My information probably comes from that same source, and yes, it does say Coffeyville. There was it was the railhead for the Leavenworth Galveston, I think. Leavenworth Lawrence Galveston Railroad, I think was the railroad that came there. And then I've seen another reference that says it went on up to St. Joseph, Missouri. So I don't know. If you could get off to the railhead at Coffeyville, I don't know why you would continue on unless it went on to St. Joseph before the railroad reached Coffeyville, possibly. But those are the two railheads that I have seen referenced.
Great. Now, also there's Chisholm, Texas, and where is Sampson Chisholm buried?
I have not found that. Well, wait, no, I read he was buried on his ranch. So
And which one?
it's marked, the Muskogee Nation one. So it would have been in Oklahoma, but I don't think it's marked. I don't believe it's marked.
So how familiar are you with the Chisholm Ranch in Texas outside of Royce City?
Not familiar very much at all. I just know that that was where he was said to begin his trail, that where the trail began, and I make the assumption that it was at his ranch that he began the trail.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Any other quick questions from anyone? Boy, Jonita, thank you so much. We'll have to learn more about the Jefferson Highway and this fascinating element of history. You keep up your good writing and speaking and sharing. We greatly appreciate you. Well, we're approaching our time boundary for our March session. Lonnie, you want to say a word about what we might expect for April Cattle Trails Showcase?
Okay, well, we're going from the east to the west next month. We're actually going to visit Pueblo, Colorado, to the Goodnight Barn. It's a historical barn there that has still operated in a museum setting, and a very large barn. And they talk about the history when the cattle had to move out of Kansas and kind of go up more towards Colorado to get to Wyoming and Montana. And so it should be another very interesting aspect and kind of widen our view of all the cattle trails.
I'm glad you put it that way, Lonnie. We are talking about a cattle trails consortium reaching beyond the Chisholm and the Western. And the Shawnee and the Sampson Chisholm Trail will be an example to the east, and Goodnight Loving to the west. So we look forward to learning about a whole lot more of fun things. So Friday, April 12, 2024 would be our next Cattle Trails Showcase. I might also mention, and speaking of the Cattle Trails Consortium, we're inviting folks from multiple cattle trails to meet in Dodge City, Kansas. So mark your calendars for November 1 and 2 of 2024 in Dodge City for a celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Western Cattle Trail, plus partners with the Chisholm and we hope the Goodnight Loving and Shawnee Trails. So mark your calendars for that celebration and the annual meeting of our association then. With that, to close our program today, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thanks for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next time for our Cattle Trails Showcase. Happy trails, everyone.